Imagine flying an F-16 for over 10 hours straight, deep in hostile skies, where every decision could be life or death. But here's the question most people never ask. How do fighter pilots eat up there? What keeps them fueled when they can't land, can't stop, and can't afford a single mistake? Today, we're diving into the secret world of what F-16 pilots really eat during long combat missions, and it's nothing like you'd expect. The first time Captain David Mercer was strapped into the cockpit of his F-16 on a long-range combat mission, he thought about food. It wasn't hunger exactly, not the growl of an empty stomach, but the memory of it. His wife's spaghetti the night before deployment, the smell of garlic bread, the sound of laughter in their small kitchen. Out here, at 30,000 feet, with nothing but skies stretching endlessly and the hum of his jet rattling through his bones, food became something symbolic, something grounding. Pilots don't talk about it often, at least not outside their circle, but food is one of those invisible lifelines. Everyone assumes the toughest part of flying combat sorties is the fear, the split-second decisions, the risk of enemy fire. And yes, those are heavy, ever-present shadows. But what gnaws just as quietly is the body's basic needs: thirst, hunger, the longing for one warm, real meal when you're hours away from land, flying in a machine that doesn't stop, doesn't rest. David remembered his briefing that morning. The squadron gathered in a low-lit room, maps projected on the wall, markers moving across borders like pieces on a chessboard. Today's sortie could extend past 10 hours, the mission commander had said flatly, his voice professional but weary. That means hydration protocols and meal packs. I don't want anyone losing focus because they skipped a bite. You're warriors, but you're also human. That was the part civilians never saw. When people imagined fighter pilots, they pictured Top Gun glamour, mirrored sunglasses, confident smirks, steel nerves. They didn't picture a grown man trying to unwrap a vacuum-sealed sandwich with one hand while the other held the control stick steady through turbulence. Inside the cockpit, David glanced down at the small pouch strapped to his leg. It looked ordinary, like a tactical bag, but inside were the carefully designed, in-flight meals issued to pilots. Nothing like the home-cooked dinner he craved, but survival disguised as food. Calorie-dense bars, rehydrated packets, sometimes even little tubes filled with puree that tasted faintly like applesauce if you imagined hard enough. His radio crackled. "You good, Mercury?" That was his call sign, a nickname that stuck years ago during training. "All good," David replied, forcing his voice steady. "Fuel steady, systems green." "Copy that," came the voice of his wingman, a younger pilot named Reeves. "Man, I could go for a burger right now." The banter was a lifeline, too. They joked, because the alternative was dwelling on the weight of what they carried. Out here, thousands of feet above hostile territory, the idea of a burger wasn't just a craving, it was a memory of normalcy. David thought back to the training that prepared him for this reality. Pilots were taught not only how to fly, fight, and survive under enemy fire, but how to fuel themselves under impossible conditions. In the survival manuals, entire sections were devoted to nutrition: how to eat without using your hands fully, how to hydrate without spilling precious water all over sensitive controls, how to avoid dehydration when adrenaline tricked you into thinking you weren't thirsty. On missions lasting more than 8 hours, they were issued something called the Meal Ready to Eat, MREs, but adapted for cockpit use. Some came in vacuum-sealed pouches with little straws to sip soup-like mixtures, others in bars that crumbled just enough to chew without making a mess. And then there were the tubes, smooth plastic cylinders filled with mashed food textures, chicken puree, fruit paste, peanut butter mixes. Not glamorous, but every squeeze meant calories, and calories meant staying sharp. David tore open one of the bars with his teeth, careful not to let crumbs scatter. He chewed slowly, the taste dry, almost metallic. It wasn't about enjoying it. It was about survival. Each bite was fuel, each sip from his water bladder a defense against a creeping fatigue that could dull reflexes, cloud judgment. Because up here, dull reflexes could mean the difference between returning home or not. Hours dragged by. Clouds rolled beneath him like restless waves, sunlight flashing on his canopy. At one point, David pulled out a tube of apple puree. He squeezed some into his mouth, grimaced, then forced himself to swallow. A child's snack, he thought. But he was grateful for it. Reeves's voice cut through the static again. Mercury, do you ever, think about Thanksgiving dinner out here? Like turkey, stuffing, the whole deal? David chuckled softly. Every damn mission. My wife makes a cranberry sauce that would put this puree to shame. Bet you'd trade that tube in your hand for one spoonful of that. In a heartbeat. Their laughter wasn't just small talk. It was survival too. Humor kept the hunger from gnawing too deeply, kept their humanity intact when the cockpit became a prison of noise and solitude. At one point, David thought about his father. The old man had been a Vietnam veteran, a helicopter pilot. He told David stories of eating cold beans from a can while crouched in the jungle, listening to mortars in the distance. Food tastes different in war, his father once said. It's not about flavor. It's about knowing you'll live long enough to eat the next bite. The memory stayed with him, especially now, with the smell of synthetic food paste faint in his cockpit. His father's words had been right. Food wasn't just about filling the stomach. It was a promise to yourself that you'd see another sunrise, another homecoming dinner. Hours into the mission, fatigue began to creep in. David shifted in his seat, stretching muscles stiff from the harness. He took another sip of water, then another. Hydration was critical. They all knew the statistics. Dehydrated pilots made more mistakes, missed radio calls, lost reaction time. A single lapse could endanger not just one life, but an entire squadron. As twilight approached, David watched the horizon bleed orange and purple. He reached into his pouch again, pulled out one last bar. This one was chocolate-flavored, or at least it claimed to be. He smiled faintly as the taste hit his tongue. For a fleeting second, he imagined sitting at his kitchen table, sharing dessert with his family. That was the quiet power of food. It connected two worlds, the brutal present and the gentle memory of home. The radio crackled again. Mercury, we're almost done. Tankers inbound for refuel. Then we head back. David exhaled, long and slow. His body was tired, his stomach unsatisfied despite the nutrition, but his mind was steady. The mission wasn't just about surviving enemy skies, it was about enduring the small battles of the body, the hunger, the thirst, the fatigue. And as he swallowed the last of his chocolate-flavored ration, David knew this truth. Every bite up here was more than food. It was resilience in its simplest form. David's eyes stung from the dryness inside his helmet, and his body ached from being pressed into the narrow cockpit seat for hours on end. But when the call for aerial refueling came through, every muscle in him woke up, every sense sharpened. Refueling was its own kind of battle. Mercury, form up. The tanker's calm voice came over the comms. David tilted his head slightly, scanning the sky until he spotted the massive KC-135, its silhouette vast and steady against the burning twilight. To anyone else, it might look like a peaceful scene, one aircraft gracefully extending life to another, but to a fighter pilot, it was a delicate, razor-thin dance with no margin for error. He steadied his breathing. Copy, tanker. Inbound. Reeves' voice chimed in, light as always, though David could hear the edge of fatigue beneath it. You first, Mercury. I'll watch your six. The F-16 felt twitchy in turbulence, every tiny adjustment of the stick translating to jerks and dips. David maneuvered carefully toward the boom, his eyes locked on the guiding lights. The hose reached for him, like a lifeline. His heart thudded with focus. One slip, and they could damage the refueling boom, or worse, themselves. The moment the nozzle latched, a soft shudder ran through the jet, and fuel began to flow. It was like blood filling veins. David exhaled, steadying his grip. He couldn't afford to drift. While the fuel gauge ticked upward, he thought again about food. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, replenishing the jet's life force in midair, while his own body, strapped tight inside this metal bird, was running on nothing but ration bars and stubborn willpower. He reached for his water bladder, took a long sip. Hydration was a ritual at this stage. Every swallow was as much a mental reset as a physical one. When the tanker's voice called, "Transfer complete," David peeled away smoothly, watching Reeves move in for his turn. "Mercury," Reeves said once they were both topped off. "Ever think how nuts it is that we fuel up midair, but still gotta squeeze applesauce from tubes?" David chuckled despite his exhaustion. "Jet gets the deluxe treatment. Pilots get baby food. Figures. Priorities, right?" Their laughter faded into silence as the mission entered its most dangerous stretch. They were headed into contested skies, their orders clear. Monitor, deter, be ready for anything. These weren't drills. Out there, past invisible lines, were hostile fighters, radar locks, and the constant threat of ground fire. Time warped in combat airspace. Minutes stretched like hours, every second sharpened by adrenaline. David's body vibrated with alertness, but beneath it all lurked fatigue, the kind that made muscles heavy, eyelids rebellious. Hunger didn't roar. It whispered. It was easy to ignore until it wasn't. David opened another tube, this one labeled chicken with rice. He squeezed a bit into his mouth, grimaced, then forced himself to swallow. Warmth spread in his stomach, a fragile comfort. He knew the science behind it. Steady blood sugar meant steady focus, and steady focus meant survival. But the human side of him longed for texture, for the crunch of bread, the sizzle of something grilled. The radio burst alive. "Mercury, multiple contacts on radar. 10 o'clock, high." David snapped upright, scanning his displays. The green dots blinked into view, crawling closer across the scope. His heart kicked into gear. "Eyes on," Reeves said, his voice clipped now, the casual tone gone. David felt the tension coil through him. Hunger evaporated, replaced by cold adrenaline. He throttled forward, guiding his F-16 into position. His mind split into compartments, the tactical brain calculating ranges and angles, the instinctual brain whispering fear, the human brain remembering his wife's cranberry sauce and how small and fragile everything seemed compared to this vast sky of steel and threat. The bogies drew nearer. Seconds stretched. Then, after a tense eternity, the call came through from command. Contacts confirmed non-hostile. Maintain course. David exhaled, every muscle loosening at once. He realized his jaw ached from clenching. "False alarm," Reeves muttered, relief thick in his tone. "Guess I'll live to try that burger after all." David managed a laugh, but his body trembled from the adrenaline dump. He reached automatically for his pouch, pulled out another ration bar and bit down. It wasn't hunger that drove him. It was the reminder that he was still here, still alive, still capable of chewing and swallowing in a sky where one wrong move could have ended everything. Food in that moment wasn't flavor. It was defiance. The hours dragged on, night falling fully now, the world outside turning to black velvet dotted with stars. David's visor reflected faint glimmers, and his jet hummed a steady rhythm. Somewhere far below, cities flickered faintly, lives carrying on untouched by the silent guardians above. His stomach growled faintly again, though muted by fatigue. He pulled out his final ration tube, this one sweet, banana-flavored. He hated bananas, always had. But up here, he swallowed gratefully, every bit of sugar like a spark against the dullness creeping into his mind. He thought again of his father's words, of beans in the jungle, of how soldiers across generations shared this strange bond, meals that weren't meals, eaten in places where eating was an afterthought to survival. And he felt it deeply. Food was the most human thread tying them back to the ground, to families, to kitchens that smelled of garlic bread or turkey or cinnamon pies. When command finally called the return order, relief swept over David like a wave. His jet turned toward home, engine steady, body trembling with exhaustion but spirit lifted by the simple thought. He'd made it through another mission. Another day. Another handful of rations. Another belly not quite satisfied, but alive. As the base lights finally glittered on the horizon, David whispered to himself, a vow carried only by the hum of the cockpit. "When I get home, the first bite will taste like heaven." And with that, he tightened his grip, guiding his bird down toward safety, toward land, toward a table where food wasn't just survival, but love. The wheels touched down with a jarring thud, the F-16 shuddering as rubber met asphalt. Captain David Mercer's body sagged against the seat as the roar of the engine softened. His mission was over. The jet rolled down the runway, slowing, the night air around the base alive with lights and motion. He had been gone for nearly 12 hours, though to him, it felt like a lifetime. When the canopy opened, the cool desert air rushed in, hitting his sweat-soaked face. It was the first breath of freedom he'd had since strapping into the cockpit. Hands trembling, he unfastened his harness, muscles stiff, and climbed down the ladder. The ground crew was waiting, their faces calm, professional. "Good flight, Captain?" one of them asked, though the question was routine, almost ceremonial. David managed a nod. "She flew true." His voice cracked from dryness, throat parched. He reached for his water bottle and drained half of it in a single swallow, the liquid warm but blissful. Reeves landed moments later, climbing down with a crooked grin. "Well," he said, tugging off his helmet, "we didn't die. Guess that's a win." David chuckled weakly. Always a win. He noticed the younger pilot's eyes, ringed with exhaustion, yet still lit with the same hunger that gnawed at his own belly. Reeves pulled a crumpled bar wrapper from his pocket and waved it. "Last one. Chocolate. Saved it for the landing." David smirked. "Smart man." They walked together toward the squadron building, boots crunching against the tarmac. Around them, jets were still arriving, the air alive with the scent of jet fuel and the heavy hum of engines cooling. It was the smell of war, of steel birds returning home. Inside the ready room, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Pilots slumped into chairs, peeling off gloves, tossing helmets onto tables. The debriefing began almost immediately, mission reports, radar contacts, fuel logs. Even after hours of tension, there was no rest yet. But what lingered in the back of every mind, unspoken but deeply felt, was food. Real food. David listened, contributed when asked, but part of him drifted. He imagined plates clinking, the warmth of a meal not squeezed from a plastic tube. He thought of his wife's smile when she slid a steaming dish onto their table, the way the aroma filled the house. That thought alone kept him upright through the monotony of the report. When the debrief finally ended, the squadron dispersed, some heading for showers, others collapsing into bunks. David and Reeves walked together toward the mess hall, the promise of something, anything, better than ration paste pulling them forward. The hall was quiet at that late hour, but the kitchen staff always kept something warm for returning crews. Tonight, it was simple fare, trays of scrambled eggs, sausage links, bread rolls, and fruit. Nothing fancy, but to David, it looked like a feast. He grabbed a plate, his hands almost trembling with eagerness, and sat across from Reeves. They ate in silence at first, shoveling food with the desperation of men who'd been denied texture, taste, and warmth for too long. The eggs were fluffy, the sausage greasy, the bread soft. And yet, none of it was gourmet. To a civilian, it was cafeteria food at best. But to David, every bite carried the weight of survival. He could taste the hours in the sky, the danger, the exhaustion, all dissolving as his stomach finally filled with something real. Reeves broke the silence first. "You ever notice how food tastes different after missions?" David looked up, nodded. "Like it's more alive. Like you've earned it." "Exactly," Reeves said, grinning faintly. "That sausage right there? 5-star dining." They laughed, the sound raw but genuine. Afterward, David lingered at the table, slowing down, savoring each remaining bite. He thought again about his father, about cold beans in Vietnam, about soldiers in trenches, in deserts, in skies, all bound by this strange ritual of eating wherever and however they could. Food wasn't just fuel. It was a thread, stitching together warriors across generations. Later that night, after a quick shower, David walked outside the barracks. The desert air was still warm, but cooler now, the stars stretching endlessly overhead. He looked up, imagining the dark sky he had just returned from, the hum of his jet still echoing in his bones. And he thought about the tubes and bars, about how ridiculous they seemed when compared to the meal he'd just eaten. But he knew the truth. Those rations were more than calories, they were lifelines. Every squeeze, every dry bite, was an act of endurance. A pilot could not fight without them. They were reminders that even in the harshest conditions, the body demanded care and the mind demanded connection to home. David closed his eyes, picturing his wife's kitchen once more. He could almost smell the garlic bread, almost hear the bubbling of a pot on the stove. Soon enough, he'd be there again, sitting across from her. Not as Captain Mercury in a steel bird, but simply David, a man with a plate of food and the quiet joy of being alive to eat it. Because in the end, that was the truth that only those who flew these missions understood. Food wasn't just about hunger. It was about humanity. It was the promise that after the fight, after the endless sky and the constant danger, there was still warmth waiting on the ground. A plate. A table. A reminder of why they fought in the first place. And with that thought, David smiled softly into the night, his belly finally full, his spirit grounded once more.